Hello, everyone. I welcome you to the last event of the Lise Meitner groups and the Berlin Contemporary China Network's year-long online lecture series called China, the New Science Superpower. Today, we conclude the series with a roundtable discussion about the state of the debate and the measures around recalibrations of academic relations with the People's Republic of China. I will start with a few technical aspects first, because this also makes cutting of the video later a bit easier. So you can see it's a regular Zoom meeting. We can all turn cameras on and off, which we can do later. I would suggest for the first part of this panel that you all make sure you're muted, that you also turn your cameras off, because that will allow you to choose, I think it's called speakers with camera on mode, and then you can see all the panelists who are active in the first part of the meeting, and then later when we have the interactive Q&A part, you can do what you like, switch on cameras, microphones, and so on. I'll let you know when we get to that part. So the topic, as I said, is academic relations with the PRC. There are currently a lot of events on this topic, and as probably all of you know, the topic is also increasingly hotly debated. So I thought that I would first start with a few sentences of explanation what the motivation and the goal of this event, in my view, was, and what I think it can contribute to the debate. And during those remarks, I will also introduce today's speakers, and it will hopefully become clear why I approached and invited especially them. So we do this roundtable in the way that we did it in this series all along. I would say we basically present social science and humanities research perspectives on the development of the science system in the People's Republic of China and its global integration. In this final event, we look at all this against the background of a world that is still based on nation state. So while we can say bluntly that science is global, the design of science relations between countries is crucial and is therefore something we also need to look at. And that's the topic of today. So what are the debates that are going on about this topic? What are the principles and the rules and the structures that are created to shape these relations? What are the main concerns and hopes of different sides and actors, and how can they be characterized, for example, by the terms that are chosen for the title of this event? Are there differences in the debates and the approaches between countries? My feeling is there are. When I look at how the same kind of crucial problems and concerns are debated even in European countries, I think there are differences, but you can all correct me in the debate that follows. What are the main suggestions that are made, and how do they get picked up and transformed into material like manifest measures? Why and with what effect, if that is already visible? So you can see I am conceptualizing this debate more as a sort of stock taking, or not an evaluation, but more a reflection of the current situation and the debates on academic relations with the PRC and how recalibrations are done, rather than an event which will result in yet another list of suggestions or guidelines to be followed. We'll, I'm sure, also touch upon these aspects, but for the time being, I would like to challenge us to take these meta-reflections, to kind of also take the position of a third-party observer of what is going on. And here, of course, the choice of panelists comes in. I have deliberately approached colleagues whom I know are gathering data related to the questions and concerns with regard to academic cooperation with the People's Republic of China, also who have a longer-term perspective on the developments that are currently unfolding, and who are sometimes also actively engaged themselves in the more public debates around the issue. And now I'll introduce them to you in an alphabetic order. With us today is Conlé, who just returned from a trip to China We are happy he is here, even though he might still suffer from a jet lag. He's a research fellow at Deutsches Elektronensynchrotron DESY in Hamburg, where he's also the coordinator of the project WeCoop Infra, a project that develops recommendations for handling cooperation with China at large research infrastructures. He's also an associate at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, where he co-authors the Asia-Pacific research area called APRA monitoring. I think that is something many of you would know as a very valuable resource. Markus has done extensive research on China's regional and sectoral innovation systems, and he is, because of this current project now, also very, very close to how the debates that I talked about are unfolding in the natural sciences, because I think it is important to take into account that there are actually differences to how questions are debated in the social sciences, humanities, where often things like taboo topics or censorship are a big concern, and the natural sciences, where, for instance, dual use or military civil fusion comes into play. Then Katrin Kinzelbach, who is professor of political science at Erlangen-Nürnberg University, and among her many other affiliations, an associated project manager at the VDEM Institute in Gothenburg, where she is focused on the worldwide assessment of academic freedom. She is engaged in various committees on the same topic, for example, the Academic Freedom Committee of the International Studies Association, and she is the founder of the Academic Freedom Index, which I'm sure that all of you have heard about, because when you have events on this topic, it is the Stoff Report and the Academic Freedom Index, which are like the go-to resource that people are talking about. So she did that. And she's also, as far as I know, engaged in a project together with colleagues that studies infringements on academic freedom, including from China in Europe. But we'll hear more about that later. Then our third speaker, Tommy Shih, is professor in business administration at Lund University and a senior advisor at the Swedish Foundation for International Cooperation in Research and Higher Education, called STINT. He was also a senior advisor at the Swedish National China Center, established by the Swedish government, and served as an expert in the areas of science, technology, and industry. At STINT, he is in charge of leading the work on responsible internationalization, and I can say that I think that's what you coined, this term, responsible internationalization. Also heavily working on research integrity. I think two more terms that we can bring into this debate. And this initiative is done in close collaboration with international funding agencies and partnerships such as NSF in the US, the Swedish Research Council, and the Japan Science and Technology Agency. You can also talk to us a little bit about a comparison between how different countries, as I've just said, approach the topics. And last but not least, Zuoyoue Wang, who is professor of history at California State Polytechnic University and specializing in science, technology, and politics in modern United States, China, and in transnational context. He is a trained physicist and has in his career as a historian of science published, for example, a book called Sputnik's Shadow, the President's Science Advisory Committee and Cold War America of 2008. He's currently studying the history of Chinese American scientists and US-China scientific relations, for which he received a grant from the National Science Foundation. And as you can easily imagine, I'm very interested in whether and how he would put the current developments, also being based in the US, into a historical comparative perspective for us. We did not have a pre-meeting. I just circulated a few of the main questions I had with the panelists beforehand. So it's a rather open debate where we can touch upon topics that come up spontaneously. We'll see where we go. As I said, we'll start on the panel and then we'll later open up for an interaction with the audience. In preparation of this panel, I have deliberately chosen not to ask our panelists for an input statement of a few minutes, for different reasons. I wanted to rather try a different warm-up activity. You can take it with a grain of salt. So I warned them. I did not circulate these questions with them, but I have 3 questions where I would like them to answer with a short yes or no. Just be brave. We can always come back to the issues, or I'm sure we'll come back to the issues later. And you can also, of course, explain your choice of answers and revise it if you like. But let's try. I myself just also choose the video panel view here, and then it's easier to find you on my screen. So my first question to you would be, when we look at what is happening, so the PRC's political leadership is obviously increasingly making full-fledged academic relations with the world difficult, given the conditions on the ground in China, but also restrictions on data transfer and many other things. And other countries are themselves also trying to safeguard themselves from risks of corporations, and are choosing to work on measures that you could say could lead to an increased closure of national academic systems. So does this mean that we'll see a kind of deglobalization or renationalization of science overall in the coming years? I'll pick Markus to answer yes or no first.
Wow. Well, it's
just yes or no.
If it's just yes or no, then I tend to say, let's say yes.
Yes, okay. Tommy?
Yes.
Zuoyoue?
Yes, but depending on how long we were talking about.
Okay, some adjectives are allowed, yes. And Katrin, please.
I say no.
Okay, interesting. That's actually what I hope for, to have some diversity on the panel. Great. As I said, we'll come back to the question. Then I was struck by a report that Bloomberg had on Monday. The title read, "Dutch seek to bar Chinese students from tech courses in chip war." And then in the abstract below, it says, "The Dutch government is working on legislation that will be used to bar Chinese students from university programs on sensitive technologies, including semiconductors and defense, according to people with knowledge of the matter." It's the first reporting. I think we'll need to see how exactly it will play out and how it is implemented. It is an initiative that was confirmed by the Dutch government. So the question to you is that a development and a kind of measure that you expect we'll see in more countries in the near future?
Hopefully, no.
Zuoyoue, you were nodding.
I think yes, in the near future. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Katrin, your vote?
Yeah, I also say yes.
Mm-hmm. Tommy?
Yes, for me also.
Okay, interesting. We'll come back. I was surprised because it's the first time I heard about this in the European context, but maybe I'm just ignorant of developments going on. Last question, and then you can explain yourselves more in the coming on the coming topics. Some observers like to call what is happening in science and in academia, also in basically all other fields at the moment, I would see, between countries, as a new Cold War. So referring to the state of large parts of the world in the 20th century as a point of comparison. Do you think the current situation should be likened to this past? Because there's something to learn? Should we call it a new Cold War? Tommy?
Not yet.
Mm-hmm. Katrin?
With nuance, yes.
Mm-hmm. Zuoyoue?
I would say increasingly so.
Mm-hmm. And Markus?
Good question. If the question is relating to the same thing like the Cold War, then I would say no, because that's not possible. But it has, of course, it relates to it, but it cannot be the same like what it used to be.
So a slight.
So yeah, I would say let's say no.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. Again, I did not make notes. I don't have any record on what you voted for. We'll return to these issues, I'm sure, but I wanted to try this to get us started. But as a first question, where you now have a bit of more time to answer, I would also, for the audience, like to ask you again if you can talk a little bit more about how you would say that yourselves are engaged in academic relations with the PRC, in the PRC, if you study that as a researcher, if you see yourself more as an advisor, just also to get to know you panelists a little bit more at the beginning. Who would like to start? Tommy, maybe?
Yeah, briefly. I'm an active researcher with collaborations in China. I'm also a policymaker. I've also devised funding programs with NSFC, one of the largest funders for basic research in China. So I kind of cover a large spectrum of different activities.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I have a question on all of your research later, but yeah, I just thought it's nice to hear a little bit how you would conceptualize yourself or label yourself in with regard to these issues. Zuoyoue, maybe?
Yes, so I came from China, actually did my graduate studies in the Chinese Academy of Sciences. I taught there for 1 year as an instructor. So in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so, I've been going back. Well, not the last 10, last 4, 5, since 2019, I have not been back. But before that, for about 10 years, I went back to, especially in the summers, to teach courses on history of US history and history of science. I give lectures also on US-China scientific relations. In the Chinese Academy, they have several universities actually in the academy system. And just engage in research projects too, one of which was a collaboration to write books, what's called National Modernization and Scientific and Technological Revolutions. I think that's a Soviet term, but it did produce a book series covering 7 countries. So I wrote a volume on what's called American Modernization, Scientific and Technological Revolution and American Modernization. So that's one of the bigger collaborative projects I had with Chinese scholars.
And regarding the US situation, I mean, from Europe, we are, of course, I think the debate in the US is always a few steps ahead. Maybe it's also a little different. We'll come back to that. But and now, of course, with the example of the China initiative, are you also like a voice in the US, or do you rather watch it sort of? I know that some scientists and scholars in the US have also written letters, blog text on this.
Yes, so I did participate in some of the debate, mainly through interviews with journalists. So I was quoted in several articles, including one in the New Yorker on some of the China initiative cases. I can talk more about what I said to them.
Yeah, thank you. Markus?
Well, yeah, before I started this project where VCOP Info, which I'll say something later, I did have a project sponsored by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, DFG, on innovation ecosystems in Guangdong province. And we focused most of all on so-called new R&D institutes, which is a very interesting phenomenon because how we understand them, they are platforms for attracting and anchoring knowledge from outside the region within Guangdong or different kind of cities in the Pearl River Delta. And yeah, that was quite interesting because it's really done in a very interesting way, and it's kind of successful for when you consider that a lot of knowledge is when outside of Guangzhou, all those regions, they lack a clear and good academic and innovation infrastructures, but they are now creating it and attracting all those people from within China and also from outside of China. And yeah, that was one thing where I really looked into how cooperation between interregional and international cooperation, how that works, at least in Guangdong province. They have some similar projects in other regions, but they are not really as comprehensive as those projects in Guangdong. And well, and now I have this project WeCop Infra, which is basically about how to reconfigure cooperation within the natural sciences between Germany and China, especially in terms of research infrastructures like the ones that we have at DESY, so synchrotrons, and other analytical infrastructures, what we call analytical infrastructures. And here again, it's something. The interesting point is that until recently, it was so that Chinese researchers went outside their country to go to infrastructures in Europe and the United States and Japan to do their research. But now it's like a lot of new infrastructures are actually constructed within China, and so it's getting the other way around. So if you want to do research at the best and newest infrastructures, then you will probably have to go to China, especially when they continue to invest in those infrastructures like they currently do. And we are so to have the German tempo, which is as slow as a snail and maybe even slower. Then we don't have any investments in the near future, and that means that there's actually no way of not having cooperation with China, if that's how it turns out. So we went, as you told already, I've just come back from China, and we looked at a lot of infrastructures, particularly in physics. High energy physics and particle physics and so on, and they have a lot of the new infrastructures that we weren't even aware of. So we went to Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, and there they have quite large projects going on. Some of them are at this kind of same level as the ones that we are thinking about right now. We don't have any permission from the government, and there might be no investments flowing in there. But in China, they have already started with the construction. And then there are in Western areas, there are smaller projects that are also going in the same direction. So we are trying to have one synchrotron in Germany. They are constructing right now 6 or 7 synchrotrons. So this is more or less what we are dealing with, and that's quite fascinating. So.
Thank you. Exciting report from the field already, and a lot of things that I would immediately have tons of questions about. But let's listen to Katrin first, and then we'll move on. And also, let me say again, if you yourselves have questions to each other, please just jump in. It's I'll refrain from too much steering here. But Katrin, please.
Yeah, great. I'll be brief. You already said I'm a political scientist. I should probably add that I'm specialized in human rights, so I have a very specific perspective on China. I've had the great privilege of living in China between 2010 and 2012, and found a strong love to the country and its people. And I've continued to be interested in China as one of my research areas. I don't consider myself a China specialist. I'm not only working on China, but also working on China And for the purpose of this roundtable, I think I'm actually a scholar of this topic in the sense that I'm interested in academic freedom developments worldwide, and also the extent to which international collaborations that involve an authoritarian state may place a risk to academic freedom.
It's so you just conceptualized yourself as scholar. I mentioned that you created the Academic Freedom Index. I don't know if you have one comment on, because I could imagine that for many you are also seen as someone who really wants to infuse the public debate with the index, and I think that has succeeded. It has shown that next to the usual university rankings where you look at a lot of publication performance and everything, this is a crucial factor to consider the context factors, as you just said, of universities in authoritarian contexts. Is it easy to then, do you deliberately draw a boundary there, or?
I try not to get confused with the different hats that I'm wearing. An objective for us when creating the Academic Freedom Index was certainly also to provide data for public debate, for policy debates, and but to do so in the best academic way possible. And so I think the project, the Academic Freedom Index, the project itself is first and foremost an academic project. It seeks to measure what we call a latent variable, so a variable that you cannot measure directly, cannot observe directly. You need a little bit more complicated methodology to pinpoint the level of academic freedom in various countries, and then it's fairly difficult to do so in a manner that's actually comparable across time and across space. And I think we benefited greatly here from working with the Wiedem Institute at the University of Gothenburg that you've also already mentioned, that is really a leader in this field of using expert assessments to capture latent variables around democracy and various regime types. So I would insist that the data itself meets very high academic standards and is being used in scholarly research. But of course, it's nice that it's also useful for the political debate, in particular because academic freedom concerns all scientists and therefore is in all of our interests.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot for the elaboration. I would maybe like to go one step into the debates, because I said I would like us to reflect a little bit on what is debated about, what are the main concerns, and are there maybe differences in, I think now on the panel we already cover a few countries that we could compare. It's maybe not the core topic of your research, but maybe here you can reflect a little bit on what you learn while being embedded in also national contexts where things are discussed. And I know, for instance, what I mentioned, Tommy, you are often working with research funders or research organizations in different countries. I mean, now you are in Oslo, you are actually based in Sweden. You probably have a quite good grasp on similarities, on differences in what is currently debated when we talk about academic relations with the PRC. I know it's a big thing, but I don't know if you can, in a few sentences, characterize the debates for us, or where you maybe see differences or similarities here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm working with a network of funding agencies, some of the largest in the world, and we have 15 members in this network from 5 continents, and including the US and Asia, of course, and we also have included NSFC in these conversations. And I can say that one thing that is very common is the increased talk about securitization. I think that kind of doesn't really matter where we are, but this is something that is very obvious. And of course, the way securitization is being portrayed is somewhat different, but I would say that the national interest has somehow been so much more prevalent in the last few years, and especially seeing science as a national resource that needs to be protected. So securitization was the commonality, but then how countries are reacting is very much based on, I would say, the relationship between the Ministry of Education and the academic sector. Here we have very different environments. The US, of course, had gone very long and far when it comes to, because there's basically the only thing that the Congress seems to agree on is the threat from China. While in Sweden, we definitely do not have that relationship. It's an arm's length distance between the academic sector and then. So this means that the compliance versus discretion kind of, let's say, spectrum there is you can basically plot countries along that one. And that means also how much discretion does the sector have, the different actors in the sector have when it comes to dealing with these securitization pressures. And that can be very, very different. Some will have to comply with disclosure requirements, export controls. I mean, export controls is definitely something that is there also in Europe and in Sweden, but the implementation looks very different in Sweden compared to the US. So those are just some of the things that differ. But the thing that kind of I see doesn't matter if it's in China, it's in US or Europe, is securitization.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for also bringing up that, I mean, there's differences maybe in how these things are discussed in different countries, but there's also a kind of internal differentiation within the countries. Like if we look at science managers, scientists, the governments, the ministries, different disciplines. So I think that's a very interesting perspective to open up for us. I mentioned in the abstract that my feeling was that the US was always a little bit earlier in talking about security and technology and things like that. And well, I mean, if I speak for Germany, for instance, it isn't there now in the debate, but it started, in my view, and now you can all correct me, it started a bit more from the normative perspective of academic freedom, that there is a risk for any kind of discipline if you collaborate with an authoritarian state or with actors that are based and constrained by an authoritarian state. And so there was not so much difference made between, or maybe even less attention paid to dual use things and military civil fusion and more on academic freedom overall. But maybe that's an odd depiction. I think we are there now that technology, knowledge drain, dual use, securitization is there at the forefront as well, but it took a while. I don't really have an explanation for why that is, but I don't know if the others can help me here, if you see that in a completely different light. I don't know, Markus, Katrin, you also have, I think, a very close view on things in Germany. Would you say that securitization is what would characterize the debates here?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think a lot of the debate came actually from the United States over. They have a much larger security sector. I mean, they have larger military, they have larger, yeah, all kinds of security, and those sectors have already warned against China in the 1990s. I mean, as a threat to the hegemony of the United States, as a threat to all sorts of things, and I think that is a kind of different debate that was going on in Europe all over the time, and it still is to some extent, because when you look at the debates then in the US, it has a strong flavor of containment, of saying, okay, we want to remain number one. And I mean, Europe had never this idea, or at least in the past decades, that you want to stay number one because you are not number one. So there's the original situation was already different, and but the security the whole idea of securitization came actually from a lot of Anglo-Saxon countries, and a lot of publications that are now in Germany are actually written together with people from the United States, also from the security sector, from people around this Pentagon, CIA, and so on. So I mean that is a debate, a perspective that was that is important, that wasn't there in Germany, and I see the point. The problem is that it has taken very strong priority in the public debate, and other perspectives are kind of having gone to the side. Which, for example, if you take dual use, we are talking about dual use since the 2010s. You have the Leopoldina that is talking, but it's a very different debate. It's a debate about how to shape technology paths, what to do, and what not to do. What is the responsibility of the researcher when the researcher is a free person, enjoys academic freedom? And here I totally agree with you. It's about academic freedom and the responsibility that comes with it. But it's a responsibility for humankind. It also includes not to do any things for military use or that actually threatens humankind, and that is different to a debate that says we want to develop the weapons first, but we don't want to proliferate the weapons to somewhere else. We want to keep them because we are the good ones, and the other ones, the bad ones, shouldn't have it. That's a different kind of debate than that. But now, yeah, of course, the responsibility extends to how to go about with countries that are autocratic and actually have some idea of where actually the army is developing faster and fast, and then that's something that we really have to deal with, and that is now being discussed also in ethics commissions and so on. So.
I saw Katrin already unmuted herself, so please.
Yeah, maybe I can add. I mean, I would agree that in the debate over the last 2-3 years, we've often seen a conflation of academic freedom and security concerns, and not always clear delineations. Sometimes maybe also references to academic freedom that are motivated by maybe a security concern, and then it gets very confusing. But I think more important than our conceptual confusion at times, and I would also say more important than the US position, are the real changes that we observe in China under Xi Jinping. And I feel uneasy with placing the change in the debate solely in the United States, and more specifically in the security establishment in the United States. Yes, this has been one player that has been very influential and certainly also self-interested. But I do think it's important to highlight that it is in reaction to changes in China and also in the academic system in China. Of course, for a long time, already before Xi, we had very clear system differences, right? But both sides had an interest in downplaying those. The Chinese side tried to say, we do not want to make a topic out of our political differences because we are keen in expanding collaboration in the economic field and certainly also in the academic field, right? And itself, actually, this whole ranking business to a large extent started in China with the Shanghai ranking at a time where the Chinese side had an interest in, getting its universities recognized as top class. And of course, they have come a long way, and in many fields are top class and sometimes leaders, as Markus also just said. but they started from a place where they first had to build that credibility, and so opened all doors for collaboration. And there was no interest clearly in highlighting the differences in the political system and how that may impact on academic collaboration. This has changed. The Chinese side is more confident now to insist on its interests. The party state has specific interests with regard to the academic field and is confident enough to express them and also issue regulations that serve its interest. On the other side, we, for a long time, were a little bit naive, tried to believe in modernization theory and said, anyway, the only future we can imagine is that China becomes more like us. So we also open our doors, we downplay political differences because we assume that over time, these differences will disappear in a way that suits the democracies. Now that didn't happen. And I think we are now grappling with the consequences of an enduring authoritarian rule and an academic system that is shaped by those conditions. And academics, I think, in Germany were initially maybe a little bit slow to realize that the differences won't go away, and that academia is actually an involved player that cannot simply close its eyes vis-a-vis those political issues, right? And I think this naivete maybe is something we have placed behind us in the last few years, partly because of external pushing and prodding, but partly also because of debates that we have finally had in this country, and we will continue to have, because many of the dilemmas are not easily solved. And overall, I stop here, I would say that a big difference is that the recognition, and Markus also hinted at that already, that collaboration must continue, I think is dominant in Germany. So it's not about if cooperation is possible, but how it can be made possible in a way that limits risks and also protects interests of academics, but also greater interests around national security.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. I want to bring in Zuoyoue and maybe finally also Tommy again, because he has papers on research integrity, and I wanted to ask him how that relates to these concepts we've debated. I don't want to let this debate be too abstract, but I think in a way it is interesting to think about the terms that come up and the concerns. We're not talking so much about the particular concerns in particular fields, in particular cases, but I think there is a slight difference in how the concerns are framed, if you want, or labeled. So it's concerns about overall academic freedom, or it's about dual use, which also brings us to reflections on how to deal with the issues. And I want to ask Zuoyoue if maybe one difference, at least to my observation, now you can say whether it's correct or not, is in the US, because the debate is so security focused, it actually allows you to be more selective in your cooperation in maybe more manifest ways than if you're in a context where you have to deal with a principal issue. Do you still want to cooperate with a dictatorship, a country with basically no academic freedom, which does not play along the scientific norms that we would consider being existent in, I don't know, academic environments in Europe, for instance? I don't know if I'm completely wrong. I just think that this term academic freedom in the US debate, it's not that prominent, but maybe it's because I see just part of the sources or the documents or the voices raised. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's this is a fascinating discussion. The case of the US, I think, yes, security has taken increasingly a central place in US-China academic interactions. But I think, as a historian, I like to look at, as you mentioned earlier, Anna, about the longer term background trajectory. For the US, there was in the 1980s a big debate over security related to basic research. the National Academy of Science actually did a report that resulted in a Reagan administration policy. It's now called NSDD 189. That came out actually quite, looking at now, very liberal policy. Essentially, it says both basic and applied research that were, openly published should be protected in international interactions. The only control should be only the military classification, which, of course, most scientists would love to have that kind of freedom. But now, increasing the gray area began to move in the export control, sensitive, unclassified information, all that now play an increasingly tightening role in international scientific interactions. But I think so yes, academics, I mean, all affected, but I think, Anna, you mentioned earlier, there's actually interesting difference between disciplines, right? So clearly, the natural sciences, especially those that are closer to, I guess, strategic technologies, artificial intelligence, that kind of, those areas come under more control than, say, humanities or social sciences. And interestingly enough, also, to pick up on what Katrin has said, there's some trends on the opposite direction in China that, if you do the hardcore science, you get a lot more support and relatively free system. But if you do humanities, social sciences, as I've been, going back to visit, you feel the increasing control and restrictions on what you can see, even in teaching. I mean, that's why, to come back to the comment earlier, the discussion about the Cold War, right? I used to be very skeptical of that claim because, I studied the US-Soviet Cold War. That was dramatically different. Those were military oriented, and the US and the Soviet Union had very few social, just human level interactions, economic connections, for example. But when I said increasingly so, because those other elements began to fill in now. Historians who look at the Sino-Soviet split in the late 50s, early 60s, initially thought it was mainly, security or national interest clash. But I think more and more scholars then actually came to the realization ideological conflict was of central importance in the Sino-Soviet split. And I'm afraid that we are seeing that playing out between the US and China, again, to picking back on what Katrin has said. But again, as historians, we are very hesitant in saying this is the one cause that led to this and that. It's most likely multiple causes working at the same time. So,
thank you. I mentioned I wanted to ask Tommy for if he maybe could bring in a very brief definition of research integrity, and if that maybe is a middle ground here, if there is a basic will still in upholding some sort of cooperation or being more selective, and how should it look like? And I know you've written papers and coined this term, so maybe I don't know if you want to use it to bridge some of what has been debated.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely say that the semantics play a role here. Research security, which is a term that kind of stemming from the US, but we also have trusted research in the UK, and knowledge securitization, which the Dutch came up with, are terms that are very difficult to use if you want to have an inclusive discussion. I have deliberately used the term responsible internationalization. It may sound like a very generic term, but it is something that brings people to the table. And I'm not only talking about the like-minded ones, but also the ones that live under other circumstances and conditions. And then when we get people to the table, I think it's important to find areas which are discussable. And one of those are integrity and ethics, because these are areas which scientists are trained to think about. And the problem with those notions now is that what we're seeing is the development of new science systems. And we're not only talking about China, where I think the legislation sometimes is in place often, but the problem is the implementation is not there of certain rules and standards, and geopolitical competition here exacerbates those problems, because what is happening now is that on one hand, I would say the pressures to create national excellence and competitiveness. So basically what that does is that it kind of makes nations kind of go out of the way to create excellence, and utilizing researchers from those nations, utilizing those kind of opportunities that we can find in countries such as China, where I would say that the implementation of ethics rules are not always there. And what this does is that it kind of creates a little Wild West today. And what we've been doing in responsible internationalization is to kind of put people at the table, then start talking about, for example, ethics, or we're talking about integrity, for instance. And what that does is in turn kind of often lead into discussions about academic freedom also. Academic freedom, I think, is it's a plethora of different ways of viewing it, I've noticed. I mean, on one hand, I think that it is often talked about as academic freedom is lacking somewhere else. But I would also say that many of the research that I've been talking about and which needs to be handled on an institutional level is also that when it comes to those cases that does not end up, on export control list or grave ethics dumping and things like that, those are the ones that we should have collaboration. But the problem here now is that a lot of people are feeling that their right to choose partners is being limited by these pressures to securitize. So what I want to say here is that these are the questions that we need to talk about is ethics, integrity, and academic freedom, and that can be done, but we need to really figure out what do we mean with them, and what does it mean, especially when we have other nations that see things very differently from us when it comes to freedoms, individual rights, human rights, etc.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that is a key word for me. I want to give you time to all talk a little bit more about your empirical research. But since you mentioned, so bring in different perspectives, when you say we put people around the table and discuss with them, I assume you mean actors in, for instance, Sweden or Europe, or is it like also a debate with researchers in China? Because maybe one last thought on, can we say anything about how the debates are picked up in China? I mean, by scientists and scholars. We know what the party state is saying and what the goals, the formulated goals there are, but do you have any feeling for how the kind of the scientific partners talk about it? I mean, Markus, you just returned, maybe you had some debates about it, or is it naive to think there are still debates like that, transnational ones?
I mean, we had a lot of discussions about research ethics, especially we picked up the topic research ethics in artificial intelligence, which is, I mean, that's all of those questions are very difficult and very complex. I mean, what we found out is it is kind of possible to discuss those issues in terms of how to do, for example, artificial intelligence research for the common good. But on the other hand, you cannot do the same thing with saying how to abstain from having artificial intelligence for some other purposes, for example, for military purposes. So you have this one debate, which has it bears the possibility to find some kinds of cooperation in doing something good. But of course, since you do not have the other kind of discussion, you still have to find out how, well, you have to be cautious. You cannot just simply say, okay, yeah, let's cooperate in this sense, but you have to still think about what the consequences are of cooperation in this regard, with those other outcomes that you are not able to discuss. So I mean, it's very interesting, and I think I strongly support having those discussions, because you get a better understanding what people think, and in which ways they want to pursue their research, and what the possibilities are. Of course, still you have to have different kind of debate also in Germany, and how to do cooperation, and what how to what kind of cooperations to do, and what kind of cooperations not to do. So but those, I think those meta topics are things that we found very useful to pursue. So it's not just we talked about different kinds of research ethics, research integrity, about data policies, and all sorts of open science perspectives, and so on, which is very interesting, because you always find those systemic differences, and at the same time it's kind of a clearly open debate that's helpful to get a better grip of what you actually want for yourself. And yeah, so research integrity would be a good topic to pursue, and we will have more on that with the Chinese Academy of Sciences in the future. That's definitely.
If I may, Anna, I'd just like to briefly come in, because I think it's important to underline what Tommy said, that the choice of your research partners is part of academic freedom. And in fact, there's large-scale agreement on this. We have debates in the United Nations where, in the context of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, states have agreed, including China, that the freedom indispensable for scientific research must be upheld. And documents that specify this commitment clearly lay out that the choice of your research partners, including international partners, is part of academic freedom. At the same time, academic freedom is not an absolute right. There may be legitimate reasons to limit it. And in most jurisdictions, national security is one of those legitimate reasons. We currently have a debate in Germany that I think is shaped also by ministry-specific portfolios. The Ministry of Science is less ready to intervene in scientific matters, because it has practiced for a very long time successfully this arm's length relationship that Tommy has also talked about in the context of Sweden. Now, just today, Germany released its first national security strategy, and here we have a different perspective, where also on a few occasions science is mentioned as an actor that has to participate in protecting national security. And I think we will see those positions being debated out in the next few months, and probably also specified for any further limitations that the state could place on academic collaboration with China, among other players, right? Which is why I think that the Dutch example is maybe something that we will increasingly see, specific, limitations of access in light of national security concerns. Now, the devil is in the details, and I think states have experimented with various approaches here, and we yet have to figure out what the approach is vis-a-vis China. I do find it important to appeal to all researchers' integrity. we will anyway have decentralized rule implementation. Scientific collaboration is being done in many, many different locations. So unless the researchers themselves have a clear understanding of what integrity means and where they may want to, voluntarily limit their collaboration, or how they want to shape their specific research projects, without that kind of sensibility, we won't go anywhere. But of course, is a larger context. If we place all the responsibility on the individuals, and their research integrity, we ignore the political context. And I think that would be dangerous if we are dealing with an autocratic regime. I'm sure that many scientists in China would also rather keep the party state at arm's length. But they are dealing with a situation that is slightly different. And therefore, we cannot only ask for individual integrity. We have to ask for rules that allow science to fulfill the function that it has in society freely.
Yeah, thanks for that elaboration. I see Tommy raised his hands. I'll give the floor to him in a second. Let me make one suggestion, because it's amazing how time flies. I have covered maybe a fifth of the things I had on my note list, which is fine, because I think the debate is great. And now that it gets so interactive, it's wonderful. But we also have to give our audience a little bit of chance to talk to us. And I still want to talk or to listen to what you can say about the empirical research you're doing on the different aspects we have raised here. So let's say we hear Tommy and Markus, and then I'll give you all a tour de table to talk about your project. You can pick maybe a central aspect, a central finding, and maybe we close by asking Zuoyoue what we can learn in a historical perspective. Let's see, but let's first have Tommy and Markus, and then the research round. Tommy.
Yeah, okay. So I would just like to say that, yes, it's very important to understand that academic freedom doesn't give you the right to be reckless. And that is very much what I'm trying to work with. You were asking, am I talking to like-minded? When it comes to funding agencies, yes, there are discussions with like-minded, for example, with G7 countries. And there are also funding agencies from G7 countries. But also, I organized a side event at the Global Research Council just last month in The Hague. And we had 100 participants from 50 different funding agencies from all the world. And we put them in tables, and there are tables where there were people from Ecuador, Uganda, Thailand, and Brazil, Germany, and it was quite a mix. And what we talked about there, basically, of course, we're not going to talk about research security at such a meeting, but we talked about reciprocity. I mean, what do we expect? What are the expectations, or what is a reciprocal and mutual beneficial collaboration when there are differences? And that's where we put the discussion, because it's very important to kind of have that on the table to understand, well, this is how we see reciprocity. This is what we can give, because a lot of the securitization comes from the perception that is unequal to some extent. So we try to put the discussion there. And then what we're also trying to do in order to be able to have the discussion there and then be able to have collaboration is also to help agencies, but also researchers, to identify the small amount of cases that, and I can say that at Stint, we identified about 2% that kind of crosses these red lines. And I've heard other funding agencies saying about the same when they have gone through their applications. And it was similar when FBI went through NIH's and NSF's projects with Chinese ties. And so the thing here is, what we have tried to do is to identify which are those cases, and this is where the government or state actors need to have some clarity. But then the other part here, where there is a lot of gray areas, we just need to have researchers take the responsibility, because they have their academic freedom, but they also have the responsibility to manage in a way which is conducive for further collaboration and not kind of escalating them into the black. So
thanks for also already bringing in some data from your work. Markus?
I just quickly wanted to respond to Katrin. First of all, the Xi Jinping issue, of course, I didn't mention him, first of all, because from the perspective where I'm coming from, I mean, the whole idea is I'm doing research on what happens in China on in terms of innovation systems, and so everything that happens in China is more like taken as a given, where you look at and then you look for a best response. And so what I'm talking about is whether is it the best response that we do given the system that that China has. So it does. So it's basically rather what do we do as a response, and whether this response is the best one. That's my perspective, how I look at the matter, and so it doesn't really matter whether Xi Jinping has a strong of has even more strongly got into cutting the autonomy of researchers. So it's simply there. We have knowledge about what happens in China, but what is now the best response, and that's what I'm looking at. And I think what we are doing right now is not the best response to it, because on the one hand, we have been talking about China competency a lot in the recent years, but we also have to talk about science, natural science competency, and a lot of things that seem to be quite reasonable for area students and political scientists and economists are kind of when you really look into them, and how the natural sciences actually work, then it isn't practical. It is not the best thing. It doesn't seem as the best thing to do if you really want to stay on top, and if you really want to stay competitive. I mean, there are different kinds of factors that you can apply. I mean, a strong point is, are you able to invest into your own science system? If not, then of course, China, it doesn't matter whether you cooperate with China or not. They will increase their sufficiency, their competencies. They will increase their capabilities in all sorts of things, and because learning by doing is the essential thing. And a lot of research is done in infrastructures, and infrastructures are basic engineering problems, and they have a lot of engineers. They will do this. If you do not cooperate, then it slows them down, but they will learn by having those investments. And if we cannot have similar investments in Europe, then the only way is to look how we can learn by doing. And learning by doing is always, a lot of cooperation is simply to get access to infrastructures, to data, to things. And here's the idea, how can we get to those research resources or whatever you want, innovation resources, knowledge resources, in order to get more competent by ourselves, and in order to stay competitive. That's one of the main questions that we are dealing with, and here the problems really start.
Yeah, because I think, I mean, that was a very pragmatic argument in the debate. I think there's also the more principled arguments in the debate say, okay, then we are not part of it, but we are also not part of any of the misuses that are possible or something. But I think, again, I have to take time into account. I still want to hear a little bit about your empirical work. And we don't have time to go into in-depth presentations now, but since we've talked about, how do we, for instance, identify what are the best responses? You mentioned, Markus, that we need to find the best responses. What are our indications to say this is, how would we measure in the end whether this response has been a good one? What is the benchmark for that? I don't know, maybe you can give us an example of that. Katrin can say a few sentences about her ongoing projects. Tommy, the data you already mentioned was very interesting. Maybe you have one more example in that direction, and then Zuoyoue helps us to close the discussion, and then we hopefully still have a few minutes for our audience. I hope the audience excuses. We have 4 excellent speakers. I really want to give you the time to make your points, so we have to cut down a little bit on the Q&A part, but please, who wants to go first? Markus, maybe with a first short response to the what is the best response question?
I think the best response is yeah, that's really where we have to start thinking what is actually, what are our objectives, and I think we're still not really done with really defining what do we want, where we actually what a strategy is actually about. It's what is our position in the world, and where do we want to stay? How do we think our position is to be in the next 5-10 years from now? And how do we reach this position, or how do we stay at the position that we are right now? These objectives need to be clear, and then you have to find indicators how to stay. So indicators are the obvious ones when you look at the science and innovation indicators, but it's also other parts. For example, how the possible until recently, like the United States and Europe is practically actually defining where technology development is going to. So take for example this ChatGPT. It's developed in the United States, and the other ones are following. And in most sectors, it's simply that the basic questions that we are dealing with are developed here. They are not until recently they are not developed in China. But and also when I told you about all those infrastructures, analytical infrastructures, this basic setup is defined in Europe and in the United States. But this can change, and then and with this everything, so where technology development is heading to, what standards are we taking, and so will be defined somewhere else. And in order to stay on top, it's really that we have to stay in the position to really define where the field is heading, and that means that we have to have enough investment, enough output. So both innovation inputs and innovation outputs have to be. We still have to be at the forefront, and how this is to be done, and how in order, and it means also that we have to affect or what is happening in other parts of the world, or co-define with it. When we go separate, then it will be very difficult. I mean, that's what go.
I'm still wondering, is there a collective we? Because I can somehow imagine that there is a strategy by the minute, like China strategy, maybe soon coming out, I don't know, after the national security strategy. So that there is a we, I can very much see, but you are also interviewing scientific actors, right? Is it really so easy to?
But those are just sectors. I mean, you can define what is coming out, but first of all, there need to be researchers that have the idea for this, and get any government actors. They can't only follow, because they are not scientists by themselves. I mean, whether you look at nuclear energy, if there are no nuclear scientists that work out basics and say, okay, here there's those possibilities. Without them saying this, there is no government that says, oh, let's do this and that, or now. When you go to all these things about artificial intelligence, without the researchers, that's where the scientific responsibility comes in, because what what is possible is not set by the government or the politicians. They can only specify areas that are already there. They cannot say, well, let's go for kryptonite or whatever, because the scientists have to think of them at the forefront, and then everything else is coming, and they can also decide in which ways one is heading. But the government basically comes in when there's already sectors, and there are some researchers that can point out the possibilities where it's going, where it can go, and they can demand something like military applications also.
Interesting perspective. Does it align with your experiences, Tommy, when you talk to stakeholders?
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, I think that no one is better than the scientists to know kind of like what's driving their field and what is needed. And of course, I'm working with funding agencies, and the funding agencies is somewhere in between there, where they need to consider excellence, they need to consider interest from the researchers, and also the interest from the state. So very much what I've been trying to do is to kind of look at what are these few percent that are kind of should be off limit, and then I'm asking myself, the data that I'm working with is very much about why do these still come into the funding agencies? Why do these cases come into the funding agencies? These ethics dumping, grave cases of ethics dumping, it could be something that is not in line with export controls or etc. So then the other question is how do we impact that responsibility way of thinking, before it comes in? And then the second part would be working with the policymakers and with governments. So how do we establish the conditions to work meaningfully with the rest of the cases, where especially those cases where Marcus is kind of bringing up that how is it going to be, how do policy make it conducive for researchers to work and learn and co-create in those areas? So that's very much what I'm working on, and the cases and the data that I have, and so it's trying to work on this on a more granular level, and of course also take into consideration that if something doesn't kind of sync well in this chain, what's going to happen is just increased securitization.
And your indicators to see whether what you do has an effect is also when you see that the problematic cases you're mentioning are going down, or what would be a benchmark here?
Well, yeah, it is actually, we are seeing an increased awareness of, well, I mean, for people to kind of like not only think about, I mean, I remember when I started this work a couple of years ago, it was quite common that we heard researchers say and write that what I do is natural sciences. So I'm just out there to explore the world, which is already there. So I can do my research anywhere. It doesn't matter. We have tried to contextualize that, and I think we have, it's more successful today on that metric, that are people more aware of that there's a context around the research also. Yes, but will we get away to reduce them to zero? No, because there are always some bad apples. And people will take opportunities, and as long as we have these incentive structures that we have in academia, I don't think we're going to get away with that. But we can definitely get rid of some of the unintended ones that are just happening because of lack of knowledge.
Yeah, thanks. Katrin, your slot.
Yeah, I do have to comment on what just Tommy said, because you speak about securitization without maybe specifying what you mean by it. Commonly, we refer to securitization that is a field that is not initially seen as security relevant becomes framed in a security manner, right? And I think that can go overboard in the field of science, where any contact with a Chinese partner or Chinese university is perceived as a potential security threat. then that would be a securitization gone overboard, right? But there are legitimate security interests, and there are legitimate debates about ethical constraints, and that I feel uneasy to frame as securitization, because we need to have those debates, right? It's not that somehow a security lens is applied to issues that have nothing to do with our security. Of course they do. And here I don't only speak about dual use technology or the complicity of potentially contributing to a military-based research project without knowing that this is the case, but also about the human security of our partners, especially in the social sciences, when they work on so-called sensitive topics, right? How do we deal with those tensions? And that's something that I'm interested in. I mean, you asked about data, Anna. Of course, this is a field that is very, very difficult to research. I think to start with, we need to take official laws and regulations passed in the People's Republic seriously. And we see a wave of new legislation that restricts research, that restricts university autonomy. For example, since 2017, universities have to have a dedicated party organ for overseeing the ideological education and management of teaching staff. So that's what also Zuoyoue mentioned, that teaching is increasingly regulated and supervised, right? Since 2021, this is a requirement formally included in the CCP's regulations on the work of grassroots organizations in higher education institutions. So we can read those changes in black letter law. Now, the interesting question, of course, is to what extent is it applied? And many people who have studied China would say there can be a big difference between what the regulations say and what actual practice is and what wiggle room there may be. Now, this is something that would require more extensive field research, which we find difficult to do, and not only, of course, but because of the constraints put in place in context of the COVID pandemic. But these are sensitive questions that we feel cannot easily be talked about in China, but then we try to speak with Chinese colleagues when they are traveling. We're also interested in understanding any repercussions that these changes may have on the China scholar community. We conducted a survey in Germany last year, where we asked research to what extent they perceive a deterioration or improvement or no change in conducting research in China. A majority, especially those that consider empirical work, field research important to their interest, speak about the deterioration. What I was surprised about is a fairly low rate of reported actual difficulties. So, for example, people who have reported of not receiving a visa. Mm-hmm. Now, the large exception here in Germany is that we have sanctions placed on an entire research institute, MERIX, that can not travel, nobody affiliated with MERIX can travel to China. So this is a huge constraint. But for everyone else outside of MERIX, there are few cases of actual constraints. Now, when you compare that to sort of the perceived risk, I may not get a visa if I critically state something, then I would say we find a discrepancy between the perceived risk and the actually reported incidences, right? And I think that's just how intimidation works. You're not sure. There's uncertainty around where the red lines are, and there's uncertainty about any repercussions that you or family members in China or close partners in China might experience, and then we tend to be maybe over careful. And here I would say we probably need to learn from Chinese scholars who have been dealing with these pressures for a longer time on how to rationally contain our fears so that we can work on all the issues in the social sciences that we consider important when studying China.
Thank you, Katrin. also to all the comments just made. I would have 10 follow-up questions. I feel we need a sequel of this event because we are really running out of time. I will hand the last slot to Zuoyoue and maybe ask him to come back to this question of comparisons to last century and Cold War. You said you increasingly come to see it in this comparison in comparative terms, but however, we also saw that there was a change of the world after the Cold War. Now, listening to the challenges and the problems and the risks at the current moment, it's very difficult to see any other, like that suddenly things will turn very differently. You've all mentioned also that the aspect of like system rivalry like plays over how to ever get out of this. So I don't know, I don't want to force you to come out with an outlook, but yeah, do you think that there is the possibility that things will change in the midterm future again, or is it just the new realities of the 21st century we have to live with? Big question, I know, but
we don't know how things will play out in the future with the kind of perspective we need to actually assess what's going on. But I usually draw three I call the lessons, but from looking at the history of U.S.-China relations, the Cold War, and what I know, what's going on. So one is that we need to keep in mind the importance of international collaboration for solving global problems, right? I mean, that's not going to go away. The climate change, nuclear weapons, public health. And now we add things, Marx mentioned, Chat GPT, artificial intelligence. Everybody's sounding alarm about the threat, not to any particular country, but to the humanity in general. So we do need to keep that in mind. And we also know from the Cold War 1.0 that when we were engaged in that kind of overwhelming global conflict, human rights violation will happen, right, under the cover on both sides. So we need to keep that in mind. And the other, to go from the macro to the micro, is the need to protect the human rights of scientists, especially here. I'm more familiar with the plights of Chinese American scientists, but I suspect that's the pressure is going to come to European scientists, especially European scientists from China, for example, right? I'm sure there are Chinese scientists who work in Germany, and as this kind of securitization trend goes on, they will feel the pressure. I mean, in the U.S., it's been to such an extent. I think those recent survey of Chinese, over 1,000 Chinese American scientists, 60% of them express a fear for their own protection, and quite a number of them have actually left the U.S. and gone back to China, and that's whatever we look at it, it's a matter of a concern. And finally, I want to make a point about the importance of looking at this not only from the point of view of the U.S. and Europe, but also from China, the point of view of China. If we go into a mutual isolation period, that's going to be not good for China. I mean, if you look at historical events like the Cultural Revolution, right? That's what happened when China was isolated, not only from the West, but from the Soviet Union as well. And even, human rights advocates in China argue that there's clearly need for engagement between China and the rest of the world. So this kind of openness. So as we debate, research policy, national scientific interactions, I think the idea should be kept in mind that openness is good for everybody as much as possible. So I'll just end there. But thanks for
Thank you, Zuoyoue, for this also longer term overview again. I'm really grateful. The time is up. Blame is all on me, so the audience has to be angry with me and my lacking moderation skills for not reserving enough time for Q&A, but I could not stop you. I think it would have been a pity because we were in the middle of discussion. So please excuse that. You can, afterwards we'll talk about if you all agree to make the video publicly available. People can revisit it. They can follow your work, and maybe there will be a future opportunity for a more active discussion with you then. I want to thank all four of you. I've mentioned in the beginning, you were in different contexts. You were traveling, you were coming back from a longer trip. Zuoyoue, you can see even your background is blurred. You can see that the sun is slowly coming up. So you got up in the very, very early morning on your side to join this panel. Thanks a lot for that. And thanks also to everyone in the audience for following our series for a whole year. And for sticking with us. And I hope to see you in different contexts again in the future. Enjoy the rest of your day and take care.
Thank you.
Bye.